Hello students and welcome to Saurabh's classes. My name is Ashmita and in today's class we are going to talk about whether the current exchange rate policy is appropriate for a proper balance of trade. Whether it is appropriate or not, that would be the entire discussion in today's class. So let's start. Now, as one of the widely used economic indicators, real exchange rate can be simply defined as the nominal exchange rate that takes inflation differentials among countries into account. In international trade, its importance stems from the fact that it reflects the trade competitiveness. However, it is still widely used in many fields of economics for purposes other than trade. Real exchange rate movements affect many economic variables, whereas some studies covered the relation with foreign direct investment, some other studies focused on the effect on tourism, or even more generally on economic growth. The significance of the real exchange rate for a central bank stems mainly from its effect on the central bank's balance sheet, thus on its ability to conduct a prudent monetary policy. A change in real exchange rate leads to variations in short-run capital flows. As a result, these fluctuations would then have an effect on the central bank's net foreign assets. So by controlling the real exchange rate, a chain of economic effects takes place. For a long time, economists have stressed on the relation between exchange rate and trade balance. However, since the middle of the 20th century and due to the developments in macroeconomic and econometric analysis, some studies have started to present some empirical results. Even with the presence of trade data, the issue has remained highly debated and no consensus was reached. Now, what is the impact of this exchange rate movements on trade balance? Now, the various definitions of the real exchange rate can be mainly grouped into two main categories. The first category of definitions is made in line with the purchasing power parity, that is the PPP we can say, while the second one is based on the distinction between the tradable and the non-tradable goods. Although they might coincide in some very special cases, these definitions usually give different results when employed in empirical studies. According to the PPP-based definition, the real exchange rate is defined in the long run as the nominal exchange rate. That is, we can term it as E after adjustment to the ratio of the foreign price level, that is PF, to the domestic price level, that is P. We can consider that P. So mathematically, we can say that the formula is this one. So in this definition, the decline in the real exchange rate is interpreted as the real appreciation of the domestic currency, since it indicates that few units of the domestic currency are needed to purchase the same 1 unit of foreign currency. On the other hand, the tradable or the non-tradable based definition takes the relative price of the tradables and non-tradables in a country as an indicator for the level of competitiveness in international trade. The rationale behind this definition is that the cost differential between the countries is interrelated with the relative price structures in these economies. Under the assumption that prices of the tradables will be equal all around the world through trade, the real exchange rate is defined on the basis of the tradable and non-tradable goods distinction. That can be mathematically expressed as this. So both the definitions, as we have discussed, rely on the assumption that home country has only one trading partner. However, in some empirical studies, such an assumption can be invalid. By considering this fact, we can distinguish a third definition called the real effective exchange rate, that is REER. Now in REER definition, the real exchange rate corresponds to a group of countries instead of one partner only. Following some weighing criteria, the share of the bilateral trade to total trade volume or the share of the currencies used in the international trade transactions can be given as examples of these weighing criteria. By stating these differing definitions of real exchange rate, it should be noted that some studies have discussed the role of nominal exchange rate on trade balance instead of the real exchange rate. This difference is mainly due to whether the country follows a pigget or free-floating exchange rate regime. Now, what are the determinants effect of exchange rate on trade balance? What are the reviews and what are the approaches? First, we are going to discuss about the standard theory of international trade. Now, during the 16th to 18th centuries, mercantilism was the dominant economic system of most industrial countries. The mercantilist approach to international trade assumed that the wealth of a nation depends chiefly on its ability to possess the precious metals such as gold and silver. The possession of those metals took place through supporting exports and encouraging the metal discoveries in the Americas, and on the other hand, suppressing the imports through imposing the excessive tariffs. Now, after almost 3 centuries of instability and economic failure, mercantilism was strongly criticized by what became to be known later as the standard theory of international trade. Tracing back the evolution of the standard theory, one goes back to the years of 1776 and 1817, which respectively marked the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was a book, and David Ricardo's On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. The two books heralded the formulation of a theory of free trade based on the unprecedented success of England in the respective fields of industry and trade. Standard trade theory relates merchandise with the movements of real exchange rate following a simple common sense approach. Standard trade theory relates merchandise with the movements of real exchange rate following a simple common sense approach. Setting all other variables fixed, a fluctuation in exchange rate affects both the value and the volume of trade. If real exchange rate increases in home country, that is the real depreciation, the households can get less imported goods in exchange for a unit of domestic goods and services. Thereby, a unit of imported goods would give higher number of units of domestic goods. Eventually, domestic households buy fewer imports while foreign households purchase relatively more domestic goods. Ultimately, the higher the real exchange rate for the home country, the more the trade surplus the country obtains. Lerner further extended the typical trade theory by accounting for demand price elasticities of imports and exports as instrumental elements in measuring the effect of real exchange rate variations on trade balance. Thus, a rise in exports and a reduction in imports due to depreciation in real exchange rate do not necessarily mean a correction of the trade balance deficit. According to Lerner, trade balance is not concerned with the volume of physical goods but with their actual values. Next comes the elasticities approach, the Marshall-Lerner condition, and the J-curve theory. In elasticities approach, what happens? Trade balance adjustment path is viewed on the basis of elasticities of demand for imports and exports. Now, the elasticity of demand is defined as the quantity responsiveness of demanded goods. Now, the elasticity of demand is defined as the quantity responsiveness of demanded goods or services to changes in price. Although the elasticity approach is commonly known as the Bikerdijk-Robinson-Metzler condition, Bikerdijk was actually the one who originally developed and laid the foundation of this approach by modeling the nominal import and export prices as functions of import and export quantities. Later, Robinson and Metzler contributed to the elasticities approach by clarifying and detailing the Bikerdijk's novel ideas. The Bikerdijk-Robinson-Metzler condition implies that the change in the foreign currency value of the trade balance depends upon the import and the export supply, and also the demand elasticities and the initial volume of trade. Starting with figure 1, this is the elasticities approach, that is the case foreign demand, and as shown in the figure, as you can see, the same logic also applies to the domestic demand. However, as depicted in this figure, lower prices in the domestic country as a result of currency devaluation will normally increase the foreign demand for the domestic goods, but only when the foreign demand is elastic. On the other hand, if foreign demand elasticity for domestic goods is weak, then the quantity of domestic goods will not rise to the extent that it exceeds the decline in the value of exports, which is caused by the cheaper prices. Following the same notions, the case of domestic elasticity of demand can be understood in the same context. If domestic demand for foreign goods is elastic, the change in prices in the domestic market will lead to a change in the domestic consumer's behavior. The consumers will then compensate by consuming the domestic rather than foreign goods, forcing the value of imports to decline. If we summarize it, we can say that if the decline in value of domestic imports is greater than the decline in value of the domestic exports, then the trade balance will improve. Policymakers apply the elasticity approach in reality when a country faces trade balance deficit. They would have to consider the responsiveness of imports and exports for a change in exchange rate to measure to which extent devaluation would affect the trade balance. However, if foreign and domestic demands for imports and exports are elastic, a small change in the spot exchange rate might have substantial impact on trade balance. Marshall-Lerner condition is a further extension of the elasticities approach. The condition could be seen as an implication of the work of Bicardie. Nevertheless, it was named after Alfred Marshall, who was born in 1842 and died in 1924, since he is considered as the father of elasticity as a concept and Lerner for his later exposition of it. According to this approach, if monetary policymakers depreciate the currency with the intention of improving the trade balance, the demand for the nation's exports and imports should be adequately elastic. Assuming that trade in services, investment income flows and unilateral transfers are equal to zero. Assuming that trade in services, investment income flows and unilateral transfers are equal to zero, so that the trade account is equal to the current account. Marshall-Lerner condition states that the sum of the absolute values of the two elasticities must exceed unity. Conversely, if the sum is less than 1, trade balance worsens when a depreciation takes place. Next, we are going to discuss about figure 2. Now, in distinction from the Bicardie's approach, Marshall-Lerner condition is based chiefly on two assumptions. The first is that trade was initially balanced when exchange rate depreciation took place, so that the foreign currency value of exports equals the foreign currency value of imports. Second, and most importantly, prices are fixed in sellers' currencies. Thus, the supply elasticities are infinite. Figure 2 shows Marshall-Lerner condition. Following a currency depreciation, the trade balance is to improve only when the volume effect shown in A and B outweighs the price effect denoted as C. Thus, ML is equal to A plus B, which is greater than C. However, the Marshall-Lerner condition is also indicative of stability. If the sum of the two import and export demand elasticities does not exceed the unity, the equilibrium is unstable, and an economic model with an unstable equilibrium could be inefficient for measuring the outcome of the exchange rate depreciation on trade. Almost 3 decades after the generalization of Marshall-Lerner condition, the J-curve theory came into existence. As first illustrated by Maggi, the J-curve phenomenon reflects how a devaluation of a country's exchange rate affects its trade balance over time. Thus, it is considered as a dynamic view of Marshall-Lerner condition, or more generally the elasticities approach. In the short run, instantly after currency devaluation, domestic importers face inflated import prices as paid in domestic currency. Thus, the net exports decline. On the other hand, the domestic exporters in the devaluating currency face lower export prices since the demand for exports and imports is fairly inelastic in the short run. This inelasticity of demand is caused by the sluggishness in the change of consumers' behavior and the lag of negotiating the deals. In other words, in the short run, when prices are relatively constant, the balance of trade faces a decline due to the stickiness of prices and sluggishness to demand change. Prices stickiness is when goods are still traded at the price levels prior to devaluation. The trade balance worsens by the value of total imports in foreign currency multiplied by the magnitude of the rise in the price of foreign currency, since contracts made before the depreciation force the fixed prices and volumes. The short-run period is commonly known as the exchange rate pass-through period. Afterwards, domestic demand starts to shift from the foreign to the domestic production of substitution goods as a reaction to the higher prices of imports, causing a trade balance improvement. Furthermore, the markets in home country experience an increase in the exports volume due to the decrease in the export prices. The period of these two long-run factors is commonly known as the volume adjustment period, and they have a favorable impact on the trade balance. However, the J-curve phenomenon predicts the trade balance to improve in the long run to a higher level compared to its level before the depreciation. The dynamic reaction of trade balance as a short-run dip and long-run recovery takes the shape of the flattened J letter, hence the J-curve phenomenon. Explaining the J-curve phenomenon, that is the J figure, as an implication on monetary policy, the exchange rate devaluation should be sufficiently large to have a favorable long-run impact on the trade balance. In relation to Marshall-Lerner condition, if trade balance improves in the long run due to currency devaluation to a level higher than the level before devaluation under the J-curve assumption, we can consider the Marshall-Lerner condition fully satisfied. If not, the Marshall-Lerner condition is not satisfied and the J-curve is expected to flatten on lower level compared to the level before the devaluation. The time frame for the J-curve before the Marshall-Lerner condition kicks in and improves the trade balance is said to be any time between a few months to 2 or 3 years. Next comes the Keynesian absorption approach. The approach of elasticity is mainly criticized for being a partial equilibrium approach, which does account for the macroeconomic effects arising from price changes and production fluctuations in response to currency devaluation. In fact, it only accounts for the value and volume responses to price changes. On the other hand, in the absorption and monetary approaches, the depreciation is related to macroeconomic variables that usually undermine the favorable impact of the exchange rate devaluation on the trade balance. Now, the absorption approach merges the elasticities approach with the Keynesian macroeconomics. It was formally modeled in the early 1950s by Mead, Alexander, and some others. Now, this approach starts with the assumption that a nation's expenditures fall into 4 categories, namely consumption, investment, government expenditures, and imports. We call consumption as C, investment as I, government expenditures as G, and imports as M. We are going to consider all of them in small letters. All variables are measurements in real terms since this approach treats prices as constant. The sum of these 4 categories is also referred to as the domestic approach, which is marked in small a. So A is equal to C plus I plus G plus M. On the other hand, a nation's real income, we can consider that as small y, equals its total expenditures on output, where X is real exports. Real income is expressed as y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. A nation's current account balance equals the difference between real income and absorption, which can be written as follows. Thus, the change in current account equals the change in real income minus the change in the sum of the remaining 3 variables, that is consumption, investment, and government expenditures, which can be written as follows. This indicates that the trade account improves only if domestic output growth exceeds the domestic absorption. A currency devaluation improves the trade balance if the substitution towards the domestic goods in response to the relative price changes boosts the output more than absorption. In reality, this is more likely to happen in an economy which is characterized by excess capacity, where the Keynesian multiplier effect works. In an economy near full employment or one which is facing strong production bottlenecks, output is not likely to increase and the trade balance could improve only if absorption decreases. Inflationary pressures also undermine the relative price shifts that induce an increase in the export production and a decline in the consumption of the imported goods. In summary, we can say that trade balance under the absorption approach is a function of real income, which can be written as this. So, trade balance can improve if there is an increase in the output or a decrease in the domestic consumption, or you can consider both. Suppose A is constant and the economy is not in full employment. What is this A considered as? A is the decrease in domestic consumption. A is the domestic consumption. So suppose A is constant and the economy is not in full employment. Mostly this happens in developing countries. When currency devaluation occurs, the ultimate effect is expected to be an increase in the output, thus a trade balance improvement. Next, we are going to talk about the monetary approach. As mainly championed by the contributions of Harry Johnson and Jacob Franklin, in the early 1970s, nearly the same time the Jacob theory emerged, the monetary approach suggests that devaluation should be understood in a monetary context. Thus, a balance of payments deficit is solely a monetary phenomenon mainly caused by the excessive money supply. Currency devaluation has an impact on the balance of payments only through its effect on real money supply. Therefore, a devaluation increases the balance of payment by increasing the domestic prices and thereby reducing the real money supply. Devaluations fail if they are followed by further increases in the nominal money supply that re-establish the original disequilibrium. The long-run effect on the trade balance is thus ambiguous. When a country devaluates the currency, the real value of the money supply decreases due to the increase in the prices of the traded commodities and services, which is measured in the domestic prices. Mathematically, this can be shown as this one. The relation can be summarized as a devaluation in E, which leads to an increase in the prices of traded goods and services, and therefore which lowers the real value of the cash balance, which in turn eventually causes a reduction in the spending in order to restore the real value of its holdings of money. The decline in consumption results ultimately in a reduction in absorption and trade balance improvement. Additionally, as argued by Johnson, an increase in money supply gives rise to the level of real balances. Thus, individuals forecast their wealth to rise, causing the level of expenditures to increase relative to income and the trade balance to deteriorate. Thus, the effect of money supply on the balance of trade is negative. In the same context, Miles argues that the negative effect might not be observed in the cases where the nominal money balance may be a small fraction of total wealth. Secondly, it may not be observed in this case also where the private sector may not perceive money as net wealth. Thirdly, it won't be seen in this case also where response of expenditures to changes in wealth could be insignificant. The most significant implication of the monetary approach is that if the monetary authorities expand the money supply after devaluation to meet the new demand for money, the effect of devaluation is believed to be preserved. Some empirical studies also argue that excess money supply might increase the consumption and lower the trade balance. Concluding the concepts that we have studied in this class, we are going to just go through a recap, and that includes that although the standard theory of international trade provided the fertile grounds and gave some basics for the latter approaches, but the theory barely discussed the effects of exchange rate on trade balance and merely championed the free trade through the principles of absolute advantage of Adam Smith and the comparative advantage of David Ricardo. Thus, the theory does not seem to be applicable to today's much more complicated circumstances. Additionally, this approach seems to be at odds with the monetary approach in a specific aspect. That is, the latter disagrees with the claim that exchange rate depreciation can improve the trade balance perpetually. Moreover, all other approaches disagree with the standard trade theory in its claim that currency depreciation improves the trade balance unconditionally. The second thing that we can conclude is that the Keynesian based absorption approach and the monetary approach both focus on the macroeconomic linkages and identities rather than the microeconomic relationships of the elasticity approach. Thus, the relationship between the trade exchange rate issue and other macroeconomic variables could be better understood under these two approaches. However, relatively few empirical studies investigated these two approaches. This might be due to the fact that both approaches were not substantially improved to cope with the dramatic changes in the nature of the current account balance in the post-Bretton Woods era. This might be due to the fact that both approaches were not substantially improved to cope with the dramatic changes in the nature of the current account balance in the post-Bretton Woods era, which left these two approaches underdeveloped and rudimentary. Thirdly, the elasticity approach, which was originally triggered by the novel ideas of Bikerdijk, Marshall, and Groenewegen, and passed through several stages of improvement for almost half a century, can be considered as the most important breakthrough in the context of assessing the impact of exchange rate on trade balance. This is reflected by the enormous number of empirical studies which investigated it. However, the dynamic view of this approach, the J-curve theory, gained most of the attention. In fact, by assessing all the theories that we have discussed, anyone can conclude that the J-curve is the most affluent among all the reasons. In fact, by assessing all the theories, we can consider that the J-curve is the most affluent one. Why can we consider this J-curve as the most perfect one? Because empirical testing for the J-curve can indirectly test the approaches of elasticities and Marshall-Lerner condition by evaluating the long and the short-run coefficients of the real exchange rate in the econometric analysis. The J-curve is the only approach which allows tracing the effect of real exchange rate depreciation on the trade balance over time. Obtaining trade data for testing this theory is much easier than collecting the data on volume and value of trade for assessing the Marshall-Lerner condition. All these things make the J-curve the most reliable one. So that was the entire discussion for today's class. We are going to meet once again with more such discussions in our next classes.